Before I share Martyn's sermon notes, I just wonder, do you know what your weaknesses are? And if you don't, do you know the person sitting next to you? Because they probably do. And you may or may not want to ask them, because that may be the start of an unfortunate conversation and an atmosphere throughout the afternoon. But this is the good news that we'll be sharing in Martyn's message. God's grace is sufficient, and his power is made perfect in your weakness. I'll behave myself now for 5 minutes. In our reading from Mark's Gospel, Jesus returns with his disciples to his hometown, Nazareth, the place where he grew up. And on the one hand, he is not accepted as he once was, while on the other, he does not find it to be the same. He does not find Nazareth to be the same. Have you ever returned to a place that you know well? Perhaps the place where you spent your formative years? And when you have returned, have you found the place to be the same or to be different somehow? When I was growing up, we had one of the coldest winters ever. I lived in Ewell in Surrey, and we had an enormous front garden up to the Kingston Road. And my sister and I, Alison and I, had a wonderful time building snow people and throwing snowballs in this enormous front garden. Except when we went back as adults, the front garden was tiny. Utterly fascinating. So have you ever returned somewhere that was very influential for your formative years and it's changed somehow? Or is it you that's changed? Alison and I were down there when the garden was enormous. The thing that I fear most from my school friends and those who have known me for years is the phrase, "Oh, you haven't changed a bit." Do you ever get that one? I hope I have. I hope the Lord's work has not been in vain. I hope I'm being transformed daily from one degree of glory to another. But Jesus faced that same challenge. In reality, while the place may indeed have changed, it is far more likely that we are the ones that have changed in the time that we have been away. And it is the effect that that change has had on us that can cause us to be both drawn to and repelled by the strangely familiar. Would you like to go back to where you grew up? Some of you have never left Swanage. The places you've lived, did you never, ever, ever want to go back to? And this, in some respect, is what happens to Jesus as he returns to Nazareth. But in Jesus' case, the change that has occurred to him while he has been away has been far greater than most of us are ever likely to experience. And this is so because since he left Nazareth, Jesus has been baptized and had the Holy Spirit come upon him. He has been driven into the desert by that same Spirit, where he then faced temptation. He has begun to preach, teach, and to heal, and he has gathered a following. And the upshot of all this is that Jesus is no longer simply the local carpenter. I feel this for all of us. Those of us who are parents, have you ever been labelled as the mum or dad of X? Husbands and wives, oh, you're the husband of, or you're the wife of, as if you haven't got identity in yourself. Jesus had exactly the same thing. Isn't this Jesus the carpenter? Aren't his brothers and sisters here with us? But he had changed. And for them to move forward, they needed to see and notice and recognize and acknowledge and respect and honor that change. But naturally, because of what has happened to him and the message he has to preach, Jesus returns to his hometown to share his message with them. He's bursting with it. He wants to share that change, that wonderful miracle that's going on in his life. We can understand this. When something affects or changes us greatly, we often want to share it with those whom we know best. And because of this, we can appreciate Jesus' desire to go back to the people he knows best, the people that he has grown up with, and share this life-changing experience with them. So you've got Jesus pre the call, Jesus the carpenter, Jesus the son of James and Joseph, brother to the sisters, son of Mary, and post-call, Jesus the prophet. And we're going to hear him say, no prophet has honour in his hometown. However, the people of Nazareth had not experienced what Jesus had experienced, and they didn't expect him to be different. Your family does not expect you to be different. What's happened to you is strange to them until their hearts and eyes are opened. It's worth reminding ourselves that people may find it hard to accept a change in us if we present ourselves differently to them. If this is the case, then we need to tread carefully in how we deal with them and make sure that we always seek to act with love. They've not walked in our shoes. They've not walked miles in our shoes. They've not kept the same appointments we've kept. They've not had the same experiences. So it will take time. We must also accept that there are times when our message of good news will not be heard. Jesus warns the disciples of this as he sends them out. But this does not prevent him from sending them out. For they are to do the work that he calls them to do. And when they are rejected, they are simply to move on and seek other pastures. As we reflect on what we read in this part of the message, we need to recognize that the way that Jesus is directing the disciples to act is not a license for us to give up easily. Instead, what it actually is a call for us to recognize, to admit, to acknowledge when a particular mission or activity is not working anymore. And when this is the case, we need to let it go and start afresh in a different way. We are not to give up or to become despondent, but we are to try and try and try again. We are always to remember that whatever we do, it is only through the grace of God that we achieve anything. This is what Paul is telling us in the Corinthians passage, our second reading. For although it appears at first glance that he is simply boasting about his own abilities, he isn't. In truth, in a very lengthy passage, he's challenging the behaviour of those who do build themselves up without reference to God. Paul is doing something else there. What Paul goes on to say is that in reality, he, as much as anyone else, has faults, failings. He has struggles. He speaks particularly of what he describes as his thorn in the flesh. And yet, despite or because of this weakness, he learns to rely upon Christ Jesus, who can make all things possible. So let's just pause there for a minute. Think of your greatest weakness. We're not sharing. There are no hands up. There's no microphone going round. You know your greatest weakness. Could you rejoice in that for a change? Could you realise that when you're weak, in that weakness, God has a unique opportunity to show his strength in partnership with you? It's just a wonderful way that God turns our world and our weaknesses upside down. We serve a God who transforms. It is easy when we feel inadequate or up against it. It is easy when we feel that what we're doing is failing to simply give up. But what Paul tells us is that it is at these very moments that we should see our need for God. For we cannot achieve things in our own strength, on our own. Yet in his strength, we can do so much. Paul's message, which is a message that we know to be true, is that it is when we are weak that we are in reality strong. For it is in these moments that we discover, that we realize, and that we understand that God's grace is sufficient for us. And it is our moments of weakness that God is finally given free rein to work. I hope you've had that experience. You've been at the end of your tether, and God has stepped in and shown you, I will never leave you or forsake you. My grace is sufficient for you. And if in any small way you doubt this truth, then I would encourage you to take a moment to simply look at the cross. For there, at that moment of abject weakness, at that moment of seeming defeat, God was able to work. And in that glorious work, we find forgiveness, hope, and new life, a change in history. You may consider yourself to be at a moment of weakness right here, right now, right today. You might consider the church to be at a moment of weakness. For we often hear mention of statistics about how church attendance is declining and how people are not interested in faith and church anymore. But although that might worry us, concern you, even bring you to the verge of despair, we should not lose hope. We should not lose hope. We are at a moment in time where our lives have been shaken in ways that we have never before experienced. This morning is proof of it. COVID is here to stay for a bit longer, and it will continue to disrupt our lives. And part of the outcome of all this is that those things that were the very foundations and bedrock of our daily lives have been shaken up, torn up and uprooted. And we need to remember that this is painful and upsetting for many in ways that we may not yet appreciate. All this means that we find ourselves in a moment of weakness, but as I have already said, we should not despair, we should not lose hope. It's the opposite. For it is in these moments of weakness that we truly begin to understand God's grace is sufficient for us. And I love that Paul begged God that this moment would be taken away from him 3 times. But he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So let us together, even though we may find it daunting, challenging and frightening, let us look for what God is doing in our world, in our community, in our church, in our lives. Let us seek to join him in that work. And as we do so, let us hear him say these words of the hymn. Fear not, I am with you, so not be dismayed. For I am your God, and will still give you aid. I'll strengthen you, help you, and cause you to stand upheld by my righteous, omnipotent hand. When through the deep waters I call you to go, the rivers of sorrow shall not overflow. For I will be with you in trouble to bless and sanctify to you your deepest distress. When through fiery trials your pathway shall lie, my grace, all sufficient, shall be your supply. The flame shall not hurt you, my only design, your dross to consume and your gold